So in no particular order, we're gonna look at the breach that happened at Global Payments. We're going to look at the breach from New York State Electric and Gas Company, from the South Carolina Department of Revenue. The breach that got us started really at the beginning of 2012 was one at Zappos, and it was a big one. We'll talk about the really similar breaches that happened over the summer at LinkedIn and Yahoo, and then the breach from Nationwide Insurance, which we just heard about in the last couple of days. So let's start with Global Payments. If you haven't heard of Global Payments, they're a credit and debit card transaction processing company. They're based in Atlanta. So what they effectively do is they work on behalf of retailers as sort of the middleman between the retailer and the bank, and they handle all of the real bulk credit card processing. So Global Payments has systems that run transactions, credit card transactions 24 hours a day. And somebody managed to get inside their system and get access to credit cards. Now, this is an interesting breach. It was the news was broken in kind of an unusual way. At first, we heard chatter from Visa and MasterCard saying that one of their processors had been breached and that the scope of the breach was potentially 10 million records, and that breach had included both Track 1 and Track 2 credit card data. So that the Track 1 and Track 2 data is the stuff that's stored on that magnetic stripe on the back of your credit card. On Track 1 is your personal information, like your name. On Track 2 is the credit card number and expiration date. So at first we heard really from the credit card processor, or the credit card companies, the brands, that there was an issue. And Brian Krebs broke that story. And then we heard from other folks that the breach was even larger. The breach was even larger. It was 24 million records. It had been going on for a year. And then Global Payments came out and disclosed that they had a breach. We've never been able to confirm that everyone's talking about the same breach, but there was no other breach disclosed at the same time, so it really had to be. The thing is, Global Payments said that they only lost 1.5 million records only, and that only Track 2 data was stolen, so just credit card numbers and expiration dates, just the kind of stuff you need to run credit card transactions. So interesting, a lot of mystery sort of surrounding the scope. That's not always surprising because it's very unusual for folks to have good, strong monitoring in place so that they can actually validate the scope of a data breach. In a lot of cases, you either just have to assume the attackers got everything, or just kind of take a best guess. Anyway, this all went down in March of this year, and Global Payments is, they've had some issues since then. So we've seen them lose their PCI certification. That happened right away. So immediately, the payment card industry took away their certification as a secure provider. And their breach-related costs have been somewhere in the range of $100 million. So a lot of money getting paid out for them. Not to mention the loss of business. You could assume that when a credit card processor gets breached like this, their customers run for other credit card processors to do business with. The way this attack went down, at least appears to be an outside attacker who broke into the global payment systems by basically just logging in as one of the IT administrators. So reportedly, this was a gang in South Central America that ran this attack. It was, an attack for profit. And this organization uses knowledge-based authentication to log into some of their systems. So the attackers apparently answered the knowledge-based authentication questions properly and were able to log into the system from there. And once they got into the environment, they were able to implement their tools to sniff credit cards and extract them from the Global Payments environment. So let's move on. New York State Electric and Gas Company. So this is a utility company that serves about 2 million customers in New York State. They work mostly in the upstate area. This also includes the Rochester Electric and Gas Company. In January this year, they disclosed the data breach of about 2 million customer records. Well, they have about 2 million customers. Every one of their customers' data was stolen or exposed in this breach. They've got, effectively big database systems that store all their customer information, and those database systems were compromised. This was an insider attack. So a third-party software consultant that had been hired by the New York State Electric and Gas Company was found to have access to the databases that he shouldn't have had access to. Now, it's not clear if somebody made a mistake and granted this individual access to those databases that he shouldn't have been granted, or if this person hacked the databases and gave himself access. That much is not clear, but this organization had inefficient or ineffective database monitoring, if any, in place, so they're unable to know what data was stolen, if all the data was stolen, how often that data was accessed, if anything was modified. They simply don't know what happened. And that again, is so often the case where an organization has to come out and assume that all of their data has been breached and may no longer be even reliable, when they just have to make that assumption because they weren't watching the data in the first place. Now, if you're New York State Electric and Gas Company, I guess you get it off on this one real easy. I mean, certainly you'll spend a few $1 million on the breach with forensic costs and giving people credit monitoring and all the typical kind of post-breach reaction. But you also got kind of a locked-in market for your product, so nobody's going to be turning off their electric service as a result of this data breach. An interesting position to be in for consumers, to say the least. Let's move on to the South Carolina Department of Revenue. So this is the state tax collector for South Carolina. They disclosed a pretty big breach here in November, about 10 million records. And that breach consisted of a lot of Social Security numbers, about 5.7 million Social Security numbers, about 3.5 million bank account numbers, and 700,000 and information, tax record information on 700,000 businesses. So a lot of data. It seems like their entire tax database was broken here. This was an interesting and very targeted attack on these folks. So there was a spear phishing campaign against the South Carolina Department of Revenue. On the same day, several employees received the same phishing email. At least one of the employees clicked through that phishing email, which caused malware to be installed on their system. Now, that same employee's credentials were used eventually in the attack by the attacker. So it seems clear that what that malware did was harvest that employee's credentials, possibly through keyboard sniffing, and then sent those credentials out to the attackers. With credentials in hand, the attackers just logged in to the South Carolina Department of Revenue network. They've got Citrix set up, so they just logged in through the Citrix system using the legitimate credentials that they'd stolen, and then leveraged the user that they'd spear phished, that user's access to get to the databases. Once they got to the databases, they just took wholesale backups of the databases and exfiltrated that data right out of the environment. So they got every bit of information that was sitting in these South Carolina Department of Revenue databases. Now, once again, if you live in South Carolina, unfortunately, there's nothing you can do. You can write a letter and be angry about it, but you're still going to have to pay your taxes, and you're still going to have to disclose all your personal information to the state, regardless of whether the state is a trustworthy custodian of that data or not. Well, this got a lot of press, and the South Carolina Governor, Nikki Haley, came out and she talked about it. If you listen to what she said, she basically blamed the IRS. She said that her systems were compliant with IRS regulations, and as far as the IRS is concerned, Social Security numbers don't need to be encrypted. And so since the IRS told them that they shouldn't or didn't need to encrypt Social Security numbers, they didn't, and really, if the IRS would just change their regulations, this kind of thing wouldn't be such a problem. It was straightforward that South Carolina could have done better, but I found her position to be, somewhat ridiculous on that. It's certainly not any regulator's responsibility to make you secure. It's your environment, your responsibility for your environment to be secure. If you've got sensitive data and you believe that data is sensitive enough to be encrypted, you should encrypt the data, even if there's no law that says you need to. She did promise to do better in the future, and this is an interesting breach in addition because South Carolina actually published a forensic report from the investigators they hired, Mandiant, and there's a lot of detail out there about it. So if you Google this attack, you can find that report from Mandiant, and it really provides just a tremendous amount of step-by-step detail about how these attackers got in and exactly what they did in the environment once they got there to eventually find the databases and take all the database data. So a very good example for how attacks really happen. We just hear so little about that in the real world. Moving on. Zappos. So if you haven't heard of Zappos, they're a giant online shoe and clothing retailer. They're owned by Amazon.com. Amazon bought them a few years ago for $2 billion. So we're talking big-time online retailer here. Zappos had the biggest data breach of 2012 that we know about by number of records. They had 24 million customer records that were apparently stolen in the beginning of the year in January. The stuff that they lost was, well, the kind of stuff that you type in when you buy from an online retailer. Names, shipping and billing addresses, email addresses, phone numbers, the last 4 digits of your credit card, and your password, people's passwords to log into the Zappos site. Now, those passwords were hashed, but as we know, hashed passwords don't necessarily mean protected passwords. Now, this was an outside attack. They got into the environment through the Zappos IT system. Their servers are in Kentucky. The specific attack vector was never disclosed. It was amazing how Amazon's press machine just kind of took over and really shut down all detailed discussion about what had happened. The breach got disclosed, and then there was very little said about it ever again. But this was very likely SQL injection. This came after a string of very similar breaches in 2011 where SQL injection was used to get into the environment and extract customer data from database systems, typically from the customer management systems. Now, once again, the Zappos environment was a compliant environment. They were compliant with payment card industry security standards when the incident occurred. So they've been certified to be compliant, but compliant has really very little to do with security. Even when you take a standard like PCI, which people like to call very prescriptive, it may be prescriptive compared to something like Sarbanes-Oxley, but it really doesn't tell you how to protect your environment at all. It's up to every individual. So here we go, compliant but not secure. So the attackers were able to get in, and at the same time, Zappos is, what the news that we have heard is about lawsuits being filed against them from all sorts of directions. They did business all around the world, and a lot of people get litigious when a retailer loses their personal information. Moving along. LinkedIn and Yahoo. So these breaches probably have nothing to do with each other, but they happened around the same time, both in the summer, June and July. And they were both really similar in that there were passwords that were stolen from these guys, in addition to probably a lot of other data from both of them. But those passwords ended up posted online. Not a lot of attacks this year were, or at least big attacks, where the data ended up just getting dumped online. These two happened at such a similar time. So we saw passwords. We saw the passwords get posted online. Let's talk about the breaches separately. LinkedIn was the bigger one. So with LinkedIn, we saw what effectively saw was a big pile of hashed passwords. About 6.5 million hashed passwords were posted to an online password cracking forum. So somebody posted these hash passwords and asked the people on the forum to help them crack the passwords. Now, there was no other information posted there, like usernames, and there was no information about what website those passwords came from. But as the researchers in the security community who got their hands on that data, folks pretty quickly figured out that it was LinkedIn passwords. And the way they figured it out was by finding their own LinkedIn password, which they don't use on any other website, there in that list of hash passwords. And folks were using real randomly generated passwords, so there was just no potential that it was somebody else's. And when we saw a few of those, we knew that LinkedIn had a problem, that the data had come from LinkedIn. Now, for somebody to get their hands on password hashes, they need pretty powerful access to the databases that store that data. And if you've got that powerful access, no doubt you've got access to usernames and probably every other bit of information stored in those databases. It seemed like the attackers had stolen this data, probably a lot more data from LinkedIn, and then we're trying to, LinkedIn's got a lot of business people's credentials in it, right? We all log into LinkedIn to share our resumes and to communicate with other business folks. So good chance that the same username and password that you use on LinkedIn is going to work in your corporate environment as well, or in your email. So good chance they're going to steal hundreds of thousands, or if not millions, of people's login credentials. Of the 6.5 million, I read over and over again that there were no easy-to-guess passwords in there. that they had already stripped out and figured out all the easily guessed passwords, and it was only harder to guess passwords that were in the 6.5 million that they needed help breaking. Not sure if that's entirely true, but it does sound reasonable. So it looked like the attackers were just, again, trying to get passwords to go with the usernames that they had stolen that they hadn't posted. Now, Yahoo was a little different. Yahoo's breach was much smaller, about 500,000 records. In the case of Yahoo, it was not the primary Yahoo mail system that was broken into. It was an older Yahoo collaboration system. But in that system, there were a lot of people's credentials, including passwords that Yahoo didn't even bother to hash. So there were 450,000 usernames and clear text passwords. They weren't all Yahoo usernames either. They were people's email addresses from wherever they'd chosen a username. So it's very likely that a lot of those passwords allowed you to log directly into those people's email accounts. Now the problem here is that Yahoo and LinkedIn are like the two giants of the internet age. These are companies that grew up on the internet, that are pure software networking companies that really do know what they're doing. So how is it that they both end up with data breaches, that they both have very weak password policies? And I should have mentioned that the passwords that came from LinkedIn were just straight hashes. The passwords weren't even salted. Salt means add a little data to the password to hash it so that it's not so easy to run an attack against the hashes and just figure out the passwords. LinkedIn wasn't salting their passwords at the time, and a lot of the press that LinkedIn got really ended up being about them not salting their passwords. And what are they doing? I don't know that salting the passwords would make a big difference. In most implementations I see, the salt is so easy to figure out that it almost makes no difference in the end. But certainly the wrong thing to do not to be adding salt to your passwords. So these companies knew better. They just obviously weren't taking the threat seriously enough to do a better job protecting their information, because certainly Yahoo knows not to store clear text passwords. Certainly LinkedIn knows to salt their passwords. They had started doing it reportedly before the breach was reported on new accounts and new passwords. And hopefully they both know to avoid vulnerabilities like SQL injection. Apparently the Yahoo attack was union-based SQL injection, which is about as simple, low-hanging fruit as it gets. These companies know to scan their web applications. They know to write secure code. I just expect more from this type of organization in this day and age. All right, so let's move on to the last data breach that I wanted to talk to you about today. It's Nationwide Insurance. Nationwide, we hear their commercials all the time. They have their little Nationwide is on your side jingle. Unfortunately, this time it didn't work out so great. Nationwide is one of the 10 largest insurance companies in the United States. Just in the last few days here, they disclosed the data breach of over 1 million customer records. That data breach included both information on their policyholders as well as people who don't do business with Nationwide but had just gotten a quote from Nationwide. And that was kind of something that I never really think about. It's not just the folks that you actually end up doing business with that may be holding onto your personal information, but it may be folks that you didn't end up doing business with that just because you got a price quote from them for insurance or something like that, they may have and hold on to your personal information forever. The data that ended up getting stolen from Nationwide includes names, social security numbers, driver's license numbers, birth dates, marital status information, gender, employer name and address. Gee, everything you need for identity theft, all wrapped up in a nice bundle. The data came from 2 of the Nationwide brands, both Nationwide and Allied. Nationwide has a bunch of brands that fit under them. They've not disclosed any details of how the attackers got in, but clearly they were able to figure this out, that attackers had gotten in, and it looks like they found out that there was a problem because of identity theft that had already happened with the stolen data, and they worked backwards to realize that their systems had been breached. Now, I was wondering what this kind of thing is going to cost Nationwide and what that means to their business. So every year there's a cost of a data breach study that gets published by the Ponemon Research Group. It's a cool study. The data that from last year, or the most recent data, had data breaches that involved hacking in the neighborhood of $300 a record. There's actually more than $300 a record, but that's an easy number to remember. So if Nationwide's got 1 million records that they lost, and it's going to cost them $300 per record. The calculator tells me that 300 times a million is 300 million. 300 million is a lot of money. So I started looking at what Nationwide's revenue was, and they conveniently posted on their website their operating income for the first 9 months of the year was $732 million. Gee, I mean, if they're pulling in $730 million in 9 months, and this 1 million record data breach is going to cost them $330 million, that's serious impact to the health of that business. Really, you got to make you think twice why Nationwide didn't get proactive to protect their systems and avoid this kind of data breach by really locking down the data in their databases, rather than have to deal with some massive cost like this after the fact. It certainly doesn't cost $330 million or anywhere close to that to implement really robust database security program. So speaking of a really robust database security program, it's clear that databases are the prime target. That's where the data is, so that's what attackers want to get their hands on. So let's spend a few minutes talking about how you can go about protecting your databases. I'd like to look at protecting databases from a process perspective, and I think you can apply a pretty simple process that combines both proactive, preventative controls with reactive measures to really lock down the databases and the data in them in your environment. It all starts with inventory. So we need to understand where our systems are. Then we've got to look at their vulnerabilities, fix as many of them as we can, lock down our privileges, and then we've got to monitor our systems. We want to look at what those systems are doing, and when we see them do something bad, we want to respond to that. So let's dig in a little bit. Database inventory. You can't protect what you don't know about. So the first step in the database security program is to make sure you know about all your databases. And that means going out in your environment and doing an inventory of the databases that are actually out there listening. Now, there's a couple of ways you can go about that. You can go about the office with a pen and paper and ask everybody to list all the databases they know about. You'll probably find about 15 or 20% of the databases in your environment. You may have an inventory system or an inventory log where the DBAs actually log their databases. Query that kind of system. You may find, more than half of the databases in your environment that way. But the only way to really get a complete count is actually to scan your network and find out which databases are actually honestly out there listening. It's just so common that folks don't remember that that test database is still there, or don't count the QA databases when they think about their inventory, or didn't realize when they installed that Cisco voice over IP phone system that brought its own database with it and is now installed in the environment. So you really got to go out and run a scan to figure out where all your databases are and get a complete and accurate inventory. Now, once you've got that inventory and you know what databases are out there, you can't stop there. You've got to dig a little deeper. You've got to understand a little bit about what those databases are. Are they still being used? Do they belong on the network at all? Can you just shut them down? Are they systems that are really critical to your business and contain sensitive information? Or have you uncovered the database that serves up the lunch menu in the cafeteria? You really want to know you want to get at least a rough idea for the business value and the type of data that are in each database, because you're going to want to eventually apply a different level of security to the different databases based on their needs. Well, the next step is to find and eliminate vulnerabilities in your databases. So this means looking at things like patches, passwords, configuration of the database, and making sure that all the security features are turned on in the database, all your users are using good, strong password practices, you don't have any default accounts and default passwords turned on in the database. You're not giving an attacker the opportunity to easily break in because you haven't applied patches for 2 years and you've got lots of well-known, well-documented vulnerabilities that let somebody take over your database. You want to be able to examine all those things, understand what issues you've got first, and then you want to fix as much as you can. So get that patch level as up to date as you can. Eliminate as many weak passwords as possible in the environment, and the ones that you can't eliminate because you've got a hard-coded script that nobody knows where the code is and you can't change that password. You want to really, really, really tightly control the use of those accounts, make sure it's very well documented when and where they can be used, because we're going to be monitoring the use of those accounts to make sure they're not abused. It's likely that if you get started on a vulnerability management program for your databases, that it can be overwhelming to get started. So you really want to figure out what your high-risk issues are and sort of cherry-pick the high-risk issues first and go after, for example, default accounts with default passwords and fix them all before you maybe get down into the weeds with database security-related configuration settings, which can really be a headache for the folks who need to keep the applications running and need to regression test any kind of configuration change you make to a database. It may be easy to change a password, but very hard to change a configuration setting. It's not to say you shouldn't change the configuration setting, but you want to be able to put together a plan that allows you to make some progress. So find vulnerabilities and fix as many of them, particularly the high-risk ones, as you can, and then move on and start looking at users and their privileges in the environment. One of the biggest problems we see in databases is that we over-provision our users. Our users get access to data that they shouldn't have access to. We saw that earlier with the New York State Electric Company, where a third-party contractor was given access, much more access than that person should have had inside a database. So it's very important to have a process to regularly inventory who can access your databases, who can access the sensitive data and the powerful functionality within those databases, and then to ensure that the folks that have the access in the end to that sensitive data and that powerful functionality, that they really need that access to do their job, that's been reviewed. At the same time, you may need to manage segregation of duties at the database level. So we think about this at the application level all the time, and tools like Oracle eBusiness and SAP give us all sorts of great segregation of duties features so that we can't have the same person approving checks as deleting checks from the register history. But in the database, you may be able to do those kind of things, backdooring the application and manipulating the data straight in the database. I read about a researcher who had just this week in Black Hat Abu Dhabi released details about how to manipulate Microsoft Great Plains backend to make transactions disappear, to change all sorts of things by going directly at the database. So managing segregation at the database level, segregation of duties at the database level on the application data may be important for certain applications as well in your environment, and it's something you have to consider in looking at the user's privileges in the database. So you want to be able to really understand who has access to what in the environment and then validate that that access is appropriate for users' jobs. And if it's not appropriate, then of course you want to revoke that access. The last situation you want to be in is one where everyone can access your data, you lose the data, and you have no idea where to turn and where to even get started in trying to figure out how that data left and how you lost it. Now, once we've got our databases identified, we've got our vulnerabilities remediated, we've removed as many user rights, successive user rights as we can, we're still going to have some issues. It's very unlikely you're going to have your database patched right up to the minute every day of the year. It's very unlikely that you're going to be able to eliminate every insecure configuration setting. And even if you can stay totally patched, even if you can put every proper security configuration in place, you're still going to have database administrators who have full access to the business data in your systems, even though they have no reason to see or use that data to do their jobs. So you're going to need to do some monitoring of your databases to make sure that any of the problems that you aren't able to completely eliminate aren't being exploited to your disadvantage. So we use monitoring to do that. You want to look at your databases 24 hours a day and really get an understanding for who's accessing what data, where are they accessing it from, is anybody trying to attack your systems, is somebody guessing passwords, running an exploit for a known vulnerability that maybe you have or maybe you haven't patched for, is somebody trying to take advantage of that account I talked about earlier, where the username and password are embedded into some script that we don't know where the code is somebody logging into that account from somewhere else and using that account's privileges to access data inappropriately. We want to use monitoring as a compensating control for all of the security problems that we can't fix. So monitoring is pretty critical, and that monitoring's really got to be separated from your database. And so what I mean is you can't just turn on, for example, built-in database auditing and expect that that's going to solve security problems. It's just not meant for that. Built-in database auditing may do a good job of tracking who's got access to what data and when, but it certainly can't provide a trustworthy view of what your database administrators are doing. They're the ones who are in charge of the audit system. They can simply turn it off or tell it not to audit their activity. So it's not trustworthy with them, nor any attacker who obtains DBA-level rights. And it also stores the data locally on each database. So that makes that data very easy to manipulate if somebody who gets onto the database or takes control of it. It doesn't give you any kind of real-time insight. So you need to use something separate from the database that's pulling that data away from the database right away, so there's no chance for an administrator or an attacker to manipulate the data or stop you from seeing the bad stuff that's happening. And also give you some real trustworthiness that when you see the data, you're really seeing who did what. Now that data is probably going to be fed into a security operations center. So if there is an attack and it happens 2 a.m. on Saturday, that there's a way for somebody to know about it at 2 a.m. on Saturday and immediately kick off incident response. So incident response is really the last step here, is to have a process in place so that when you identify unauthorized activity in your database systems, that you immediately respond, that you immediately have an action plan that you put into place to hopefully stop the attack before damage is done. Now here at Application Security, we make database security software. Our products help to do all of the things that I've talked about today: find the databases, find and fix the vulnerabilities, analyze your access controls, tell you where you've got too many privileges, and then help you monitor and react to any kind of bad stuff that's going on in the environment, as well as to give you all of the bits and pieces you need to hand to an auditor to help you prove that you're compliant with whatever regulation that you're facing. I know regulatory compliance is something we've all got to live with. We don't have to believe it makes us secure, but certainly we have to prove that we're doing the right thing. DB Protect can help you with that. So if if you've heard today about things that have interested you around the database security, around some of these stories, worried about them happening to you, give us a shout. We'd be happy to dig in, have a talk with you, get an understanding for your environment, let you know what we might be able to do to help or what you could do to help yourself to protect your databases. I'd also encourage you to come visit our Team Shatter website. Team Shatter is our database security research team. We run the largest dedicated database security research team in the world, and teamshatter.com is where we post all of our database security research. It's where you can find all of our security alerts and updates. That's just kind of your go-to site for database security information. If you're looking for database security products, come to our corporate website at www.appsecinc.com. So I'd be happy to take any questions that anybody's got. You can fill them in your in the Q&A panel. I'm sure that somebody will ask about a recording of the presentation. We'll make the recording available usually within 48 hours from our website. So look forward to that probably on Thursday. All right, so just bear with me while I get to the list of questions. So I had a question about whether South Carolina is not subject to PII regulations. Certainly there are laws in place that govern PII, but those laws that are in place to govern PII aren't going to impact the state of South Carolina in any meaningful way. South Carolina is not going to lose their statehood. They're not going to be fined in any particular way. And really the federal laws that govern how the federal government handle that information don't apply to the states. It's so much up to the states to make their own decision about how to handle their data. So while they may be subject to PII regulations, if they're not compliant with the regulations, who's really going to do anything about it, and how is the consumer going to be able to show any choice in who they work with in the end? So hopefully they're compliant, and hopefully they're going to do their best job, but certainly they realize that even if they are compliant, and they were with the IRS regulations, it doesn't necessarily do anything to protect the information of their residents. I had a comment from Andy that just a comment here that mentions that PCI data security standard defines physical security as a major portion of security requirements to be compliant. Andy's absolutely right about that. Andy mentions that if a user gained access locally to a server, then PCI DSS standards wouldn't defend against that. I think in the case that Andy's talking about, it was actually that these knowledge-based authentication questions that were answered, I believe, were answered remotely through a system, so through an online-based system. And the question there really, Andy, to me was the knowledge-based authentication that was implemented any good? And should that, certainly knowledge-based authentication can be good if it's implemented properly, but if it's not implemented properly, it can certainly be a problem. Well, my point with PCI is that a lot of organizations look at their PCI compliant seal of approval and say, that's it, I'm done, I'm secure, I need to worry about nothing else. And that's just clearly not the case. We see so many organizations that are PCI compliant end up getting breached that the evidence is overwhelming. Compliance doesn't mean security, and I think if you went to the PCI Council and said, if I've just got my seal of approval, does that make me secure? They'd be pretty clear that that's not enough. All right. So moving along, next question. After a breach, it seems there's always a blame game. Is there a way to determine who's responsible? With the cloud becoming more prevalent, which party holds the responsibility? So some good questions. Certainly it's possible to determine who's responsible in a data breach with a good forensic investigation and the right tools in place. But without the right tools, without the right data to go by, without a forensic investigation, it may be hard to determine who's responsible from a person-to-person level. But in the end, an organization that holds data is responsible for the security of that data. So whether you're a utility company, a state tax collector, or an online retailer, if you're holding customer information, whether it's in your systems or you've got that data outsourced in somebody else's systems or stored in the cloud, it's your data, and it's your responsibility to fix it. Now, if you do have that data, say, out with a cloud provider, maybe it's software as a service provider, you want to make clear where the lines of responsibility are drawn in a contract. So if you are doing some kind of outsourcing or using a cloud-based service, you want to put in the contract with that provider that they're going to provide data security for your data, what the minimum level of security that they're going to provide is, and you want to make them accountable for that and give yourself the ability to have some oversight that they're actually providing the security that they promised. If you don't have all of that in the contract, you can assume that no security is actually happening. That's the safe assumption, at least. If nobody is contractually guaranteeing it, then there's no way to really be sure that they're going to do it at all or continue to do it. So it's something you want to make sure you put in your contract, and if you can't get it there, you need to think twice about working with that vendor. Next question. Are there additional things in terms of security besides firewalls that would be recommended based upon these examples? So the examples I showed today hopefully prove that every one of these people have a firewall, and every one of them gets breached. Firewalls don't end up stopping data breaches. You've got to assume that attackers are going to get into your environment. There's just so many ways in. You've really got to protect your data where the data lives. So if you've got sensitive data in the database, don't go messing around with firewall and antivirus to stop the data leaving the database. Put database security programs in place to lock down the database and protect the database, so that if somebody does compromise one of your hosts with malware, and no matter what antivirus you're running, that can happen, that once they go to the database, you can see the access to the database, you can react to the inappropriate access at the database level, and you can stop the data from getting out of that core database system and getting into a place where things like malware can actually manipulate it and exfiltrate it from the network. All right, so we've got a question about enforcing least privilege. So the hard part here, as Russ points out, is how do you figure out what somebody's minimum privileges really are? And that's a tough business question to answer. I mean, to be able to go employee to employee and figure out what data they actually need to have access to do their jobs is probably not the easiest thing. That's probably the right thing, though. So getting an understanding for what is somebody's job and what are the data access requirements that come with that job are kind of prerequisite to being able to do any enforcement of least privilege. If you just don't know what somebody's privileges should be, it's really impossible to say whether the privileges they currently have are right or wrong. So doing some homework there and building sort of a plan or a map for different employee roles and the data access privileges that are required for those roles is a key prerequisite. It's a lot of work, but I think it's really good housekeeping and really healthy work to do. And standing here staring a new year in the face, it's probably a really good time to think about defining people's roles and the access privileges that go with it. Now, once you actually dig into the database, figuring out what people's privileges really are becomes the next challenge. But as I mentioned, you can get software that can really help you to do that analysis and give you a good listing of who's got access to what. And if you've got a master list to compare that to of who should have access to what, at least at a high level, then you can really get a lot of value out of understanding what the access really is in your systems. A lot of questions today. This is great. So next question. Do your products have a mechanism for notifying the respective use in the event of when one's account has been accessed without their knowledge or a password being changed at the database level? So yeah, well, what our software does is monitor the use of the database all day, every day. And so we can definitely monitor for somebody logging in from your account, but not from not from your desk or from your system or from the software you normally use. We can also track when somebody's password gets changed in a system and provide real-time alerts and notification on all of that stuff. So any type of change or any type of change in the database or any kind of unusual activity in the database can definitely define that stuff, identify it in real time, and then alert you to when it's happening so that you can kick off that incident response process and deal with the problem right away while it's happening before damage can really be done. Next question is, how can a company comply with PCI DSS version 2 using AppSec products? So complying with PCI is kind of a multi-step program, but PCI requires a whole bunch of things at the database level. They require you to have a vulnerability management program. They require you to enforce least privileges. They require you to monitor access to cardholder information by unique ID. And they require you to have a mechanism in place to identify attacks and react to them. And those things that I just described that PCI requires are the functionality that AppSec products provide at the database level. We identify vulnerabilities in the database. We figure out users' privileges and help you to enforce these privileges. We'll track all access to the information in your databases, so we can track access to cardholder information and let you know exactly when and who is accessing that data and how they're getting access to it. And then if there is any attempt to attack or steal the data, we can provide you with some real-time alerts to kick off your incident response process. So certainly you can't come to Application Security Inc., buy our database security software and become PCI compliant by doing that alone. But it can be a big component in your compliance process, particularly if there are databases in the processing environment where you're dealing with credit cards, and very likely there are. Got a requirement about AppSec solutions. A question asking about AppSec solutions helping with dissects requirements. So sure, if you're working with a system that needs to be compliant with federal government standards, particularly Department of Defense standards, called the dissects, or your organization has decided to use the STIG as your guidance for securing your databases, yeah, I've got great news. Our software is sort of fully customized for the STIG. We've got dissects assessments totally built into all of our software. We'll run the full STIG assessment against your databases, give you a report about where you do and don't comply with the STIG. We can even spit that report out in dissect format with all the STIG identifiers and the XML that'll import right into the vulnerability management systems that take STIG information. So if you're looking for STIG assessments, our product can definitely help you. There's a question about who should monitor the DBAs. Is that the security personnel, the information security officers, or others? So Absolutely, you need to watch the DBAs. I think the security team are the right folks to watch the DBAs. In the best world, you're going to pluck somebody out of your database organization, put them into the security organization, and call them your database security subject matter expert. Let them be the real focus point for database security in the environment, so you've got somebody who truly understands databases and how they work, and gets immersed in security culture and becomes responsible for the security of the database environment. That's how I've seen it work best. It's tough for somebody who's a network security person to just pick up the details of database security and work with the day-to-day monitoring of database administrators, particularly because they'd spend a lot of time asking the administrator, what is it you were doing here? I don't understand the square you wrote there. And that can be frustrating, but if you've got somebody you can pull out of the database organization that's got database expertise, that can understand those queries, and can become responsible for security, you can really make a huge impact on the environment and get yourself in a position where your database administrator monitoring is really effective. It's not annoying, and it's just giving you the kind of pinpoint answers that you need. There is a question about web application firewall. So if I've got a web application firewall, do I need a database firewall? Well, absolutely. So I think that the web application firewall is, is a nice piece of technology to help block outside attacks through a web application. But a database sitting in the inside of your environment is accessible so many ways beyond through the web application, assuming that a web application firewall can block 100% of attacks, and that's probably not a good assumption. But even assuming that web application attack vector is completely eliminated, you've still got insiders, administrators, partners. You've got a whole network of other systems that somebody could break into your environment and get at your databases from. So while a web application firewall may help you to protect your web app and that attack vector, it's not going to protect your database, not at all. And you really still need to ring fence the database directly if you want to protect the data within it. And we've got a question about encryption. So our products don't do encryption. We actually used to do encryption in the past, but the database vendors have all put their own encryption products out there. And honestly, when the database vendor writes the encryption software, they have all the best hooks inside the database to make it go fastest and to make it work smoothest. And so we found that those solutions were, honestly, they were better than ours, and they were better than ones we could build. So we got out of that database encryption space and left it to the database vendors to run with. However, if you're considering database encryption, think carefully about what problems you're trying to solve and whether database encryption will solve it for you. The one thing I think database encryption can really do is keep your DBAs out of your sensitive business data, but it'll only work if you don't give those DBAs the encryption keys and you don't make them the manager of the encryption. Everything else you can probably solve with access controls, except network encryption. So turning on encryption across the network with the database client communications, that makes sense, but that tends to be free and built into every database platform. Got some questions about App Detective Pro, scanning systems internally and externally, as well as another question about standards for auditors trying to enforce least privilege. So App Detective scans databases both from inside the database and from outside the database. So what I mean by that is you can give App Detective a username and password to log into your database, and we can log in and run a scan internally. Or you can give it no username and password, and it can reach out and talk to the database without a username and password and try to run a scan from there. But in both cases, we need to be on the network with the database. App Detective doesn't support sitting on the internet and passing through somebody's environment, their web application, for example, and trying to penetration test the database from there. You need to put it somewhere where it can talk to the database, and then from there it'll assess the security of the database, either from inside or from outside. Now, John, you also asked about standards in place for auditors to use as a reference for enforcing least privilege. Unfortunately, the standards that are out there basically just tell you to implement least privilege. There's not much out there that tells you what least privilege means beyond specific documentation for specific apps. So you may be able to get documentation for SAP, for example, that really does lay out enough information for you to figure out what least privilege is in that environment. But from a big picture perspective, I've never seen any standard get into any detail at all to give you an understanding of, what class of users in your environment should have what level of privilege. It seems to be business makes a decision and justifies that decision and then needs to really prove that they've implemented the controls that they say are appropriate for their environment. So the question just came in here, and I know we're running out of time, but the question here is, who should perform scans on the database? Is it the security professional? Is it the DBA? Who should really do that? I've seen different environments work different ways. I think when you're building an operational database security program, though, the best way you can do it is to have the program owned and defined by the security team. So the security team is the one who owns the policy on what a secure database means, who governs how often database vulnerabilities need to be scanned for and how quickly they should be fixed, and who has oversight into the system. But I actually think that every DBA should actually do their own vulnerability scanning. They should kick off the scan themselves. They should see the results because they're the ones who are going to need to fix the problems. And they're also going to want to be able to run their own follow-up scans so after they did fix the problem, they can make sure that they fixed it right and the vulnerability scanner is telling them that the problem's been cleaned up. Now, if you can get a system rolled out that way and a process rolled out that way, you get a lot of benefits as the DBAs take ownership for the environment, while the security team gets to watch and make sure that everything's going on. And if you do have that uncooperative DBA, the security team should always have the ability to step in and force the hand to run scans, even generally if they have to by actually running the scans themselves with their own credentials. They've got to have the right to do that, but hopefully they never have to because the DBAs pick it up and run with it and see it as a very valuable tool in their environment. There's a question about the cost of App Detective Pro and what database security actually costs out there. So we sell two different products, App Detective Pro and DB Protect. They both do database security. App Detective Pro is meant for security practitioners and internal auditors. DB Protect is more of a full-time database security system meant for the DBAs and the IT security folks. The cost of the systems is a little bit different based on the models that you work with. App Detective, we sell it on an annual subscription basis as well as on a monthly kind of per database audit basis. To get started with database auditing, audit a database, that's about $600 a month. To have an annual subscription for a database, to run scans on one database over and over again with App Detective, it's about $2,000 a year. And as you ramp up in volume, there's bundles and packages and discounts that will apply. With DB Protect, as you roll out into your environment, you want to have more databases with DB Protect. So DB Protect is really appropriate for environments with maybe 50 databases or more, or serious kind of compliance requirements. And if you're in that state, you should definitely give us a call, and we'll get an understanding of how your environment works, what your needs are, and help you with pricing. Database security tends to be pretty reasonable, not as inexpensive as, say, operating system scanning, which is a little more of a commodity, but definitely not going to blow your mind. So reach out to us, and we'd be happy to chat with you about that. So I'm going to wrap it up. My name's Josh Shaul. I'm the Chief Technology Officer of Application Security. Thanks for joining me today, and for those of us who have been with me several times throughout the year in our webinar series, thanks for your participation. This is my last one for the year, so I'll see you again beginning of next year as we look forward into what we ought to be doing in 2013 to protect ourselves. So thanks very much. Happy holidays and Happy New Year to everyone.